work to the EU with particular focus on citizen perception, opinions, and discourses, both with a view to clarify how dominance is understood and with a view to clarify the prospect for democratic reform. We have an exceptional panel. We have differentiated integration and democracy in Europe. Dirk and Max are there. Mm-hmm. And then dominance within the EU in the narrative of political and social actors, Magda and Natasza. Natasza is here? Yes. Yeah, sorry, I didn't. I forgot my left side. Okay. Then we have European public sphere in the digital era, lesson about EU differentiation from the analysis of professional news coverage and Twitter debate. There will be Martin Malanel instead of Asimina, and then Giuseppe Porcaro from Bruegel. And there is no title for your presentation, but you will give the presentation. You are free. You have still some minutes for.
No, there is no title. I said everything, but
okay.
It's fine. It's about media narratives, EU media narratives.
Some mystery is always interesting, right? And then political actors' view on democracy in the EU, comparative perspective from national parliaments, Katarzyna and Elodie. Elodie is fine? Okay, perfect. So we can start. Dirk or Max. Okay, Max, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Sergio. We are the Konstanz team, and our approach to this project was to study citizens' views and opinions towards differentiated integration, here understood in this narrow way of some member states participate not in every policy area. And what we try to do, we will present some of our empirical findings, mostly descriptive today, and try to sort of link it back to these more conceptual questions of democracy and also dominance. So we start from the question of which European Union do citizens want? So moving away from the question, do people want European integration or not? Or do they support membership of the EU or not? Rather to which kind of European Union. And we argue that there is sort of a fundamental tension between more national autonomy, more autonomy for the member states, and more centralization, so more power and competences for the EU level. And yes, exactly. So this is something that Sergio and colleagues have worked on, and they have identified sort of two ideal types or extreme positions on this continuum. First, the EU as a form of economic community of sovereign states, which could be described as a return to the pre-Maastricht era. And Sergio has then argued the opposite pole is the thinking about the EU as a parliamentary union that is more or less centralized, based on European demos, which can elect then a European parliament, which can then elect a European executive legitimate government, sort of following the Westminster model. And we would argue that the EU today is somewhere in between, and this tension is playing out by the question of how the EU is designed. And Dirk has in his previous work with Bertolt Rittberger and Frank Schimmelpfennig coined the term the EU as a system of differentiated integration, because we can also see that some member states tend more to this national autonomy perspective. And this is arguably a tension that occurs in all political systems, and which is of course very prominent in the study of federal systems. Where it's always about the distribution of power between the center, here the EU level, and the periphery, in our case, then the member states. And from federalism, we know that there are some regions or nations or member states which have a larger demands for autonomy, and this is often linked to sort of national identities, their strength, their salience in political debates, the way they are mobilized. And this can then lead to a situation in which some member states have more authority over self-rule than others, and in federalism this is called an asymmetric federation. In the European Union we speak of differentiated integration, where some member states are receiving opt-outs, for example, from certain policy areas. And this sort of differentiation creates fundamental tensions fundamental questions of political rule, as Lisbeth Hoge and Gary Marx have nicely put it. And we argue that sort of there are two dimensions of these two different fundamental questions, one relating more to procedural fairness. Are the institutions designed in a way that makes also this asymmetric cooperation legitimate, or then the fairness of outcomes is the second thing, which very much relates to the externalities questions that Chris has alluded to a lot in his work and also today. And Dirk will now tell you a little bit on how the citizens perceive these two fairness dimensions.
Exactly. So I'm now showing some findings from different empirical research works that we've been conducting. So this is mostly from an opinion poll amongst 12,000 European citizens across 8 member states, and it's called the CODI, so the Comparative Opinions on Differentiated Integration. And those on the right-hand side, you do see the questions that we pose. So we distinguish different types of differentiated integration, so different subtypes, which are commonly used in the literature, like a core Europe, an à la carte, a two-speed Europe. We have something on opt-outs and exclusions, so our citizens, in the opinion that there should be a consent of the other states to allow states to opt out, or should it be based on wealth, for instance, or on breaching norms? Can member states be excluded? And should outsiders be included? And if yes, under specific conditions? And the first thing that we conducted, and this has been published with the European Union Politics in a special issue, I co-edited with Catherine de Vries and Frank Schimmelpfennig from the InDiff.EU project. So it's nice that Brigitte Leuffen is here. So this has been joint work from the two projects, if you want. And the first thing that we did is we conducted a factor analysis. And a factor analysis, I'm not getting into the details here, but it tries to find whether there's, taking these different dimensions of differentiation, whether there are some dimensions that underlie, some tensions that underlie these different items. And in fact, we do find the tensions that Max showed out previously. So if we ask citizens these type of questions, which you see on the right-hand side, citizens tend to ask themselves two questions, to put it simply. The first question a citizen asks: how does a specific type of DI impact on the EU as a whole? So how does such a policy affect the EU? And the second question we as citizens ask ourselves, well, how does a specific policy, what impact does it have on my country? So we are inside this tension that many of our citizens and fellow citizens think of the EU, but they also think of the effects of their individual state. Now we can take a look at different types of differentiated integration, and these two bar charts on the right and the left-hand side for each of these panels divide the entire sample into those that classify themselves as exclusively nationalist. Those are the right-hand bars, and here on the left-hand side we see those that identify themselves to be Europeans or mixed. And these 4 panels show support for core Europe, à la carte, two-speed Europe, and concept for opt-outs. So just a pure visual inspection shows basically that there's always a little majority in favor of these different forms of differentiated integration. So we can conclude that citizens are not in principle opposed to differentiated integration, but they do find it a valuable and a global way for creating a European Union. We do find some variation here across these different types. So the pro-Europeans, for instance, are very much in favor of moving towards a core Europe, whereas the exclusively national citizens are more skeptical, which doesn't come as a surprise. That's what we would expect, because they're cautious of seeing a super Europe emerging. Interesting, Europe à la carte, which is a concept that amongst elites is seen rather critically. Even the pro-Europeans, there's a relative majority in favor of this concept, and clearly those that classify as exclusive nationals, they think it's something very valuable for the Europeans' future. And the others, you see somewhat similar patterns. However, DI is not a panacea. It should never be used just like that, according to European citizens. So, for instance, when we ask about the exclusions, so states should be excluded from specific policies if they violate fundamental rights of the EU, clearly amongst those who classify themselves as Europeans or nationals and Europeans, clearly they think, and we were thinking of states such as Hungary, they should be excluded from certain policies. So they are ready to punish norm violators, which is perfectly in line with what behavioral economics tells us. So this is how we play games. If somebody's always cheating, you try to sanction this player, even at the expense of expenses. On the right-hand side here, we see this is not so strong amongst those who are more nationalist in the outlook. Should nation states be excluded because they're simply poorer than others? This is what we expected. We just put it in as a test case. Clearly not. This is, Chris, exactly what you were talking about. This is an arbitrary form of exclusion. The left-hand side here, this is non-arbitrary because the states themselves have subscribed to the norms of the EU, and if they now violate them, then it's a non-arbitrary form of exclusion. Finally, here this chart, and I can't move into the details for time reasons. This is from a survey, a vignette experiment. And what we find here, the only interesting well, the others are interesting too, but there are certain null findings. So this is interesting. Clearly, citizens oppose if any form of differentiated integration brings about negative externalities to others. And that can go into both directions, actually. So the outsiders shouldn't free ride on the insiders, and the insiders shouldn't exclude other states and impose costs on them. So this is Chris Lord also. So this is a little bit like an empirical confirmation that what Chris has elaborated theoretically seems to resonate with what citizens think about a just European Union. So to conclude, the question that we try to answer is, which European unions do the citizens want? And they seem to seek a legitimate balance between the interest of member states' autonomy and the legitimate interest of a strong central level. So this tendency that we see seems to speak to citizens. Second, the tension is reflected in their attitudes towards the EU and also towards differentiated integration. In principle, they think it's a good idea. It should be designed in an open and inclusive way. It should be that there is no arbitrary exclusion of member states from common policies. And lastly, citizens agree there is one clear red line, and that's really to avoid negative externalities. And we're done with this. Thanks very much.
Thank Dirk for keeping the time. I would get to Magda now. And Natasza, do you start, Magda?
Yes.
Okay, good. 10, 15, 12 minutes, something like that.
Thank you very much. We'll have a pleasure with Natasza to present a research on perceptions of dominance by political and social actors, and it's our privilege because we are presenting research that was done by many people in this room and many researchers on the way, so I'll mention them. We are just here as presenters rather than key authors. So in two different research initiatives, the one on parliaments and political actors and the one on citizens, we noticed that there is an interesting dimension to looking at dominance that can allow us to see what those actors are meaning when they mention or indicate dominance within a political system. So to limit the discussions on definitions that we had previously, we treat dominance as unjustified exercise of power, as many of the authors in the room are treating this, or a circumstance wherein an actor organization or collective can be arbitrarily interfered, but we specifically wanted to look at if political and social actors are mentioning dominance within the EU context, what is it? What do they mean? And for this, we wanted also to see, so our intuition, original intuition, was that we will be able to detect then their intuition to see where the power relations are, in their subjective view, problematic from the point of view of functioning of the EU political system. So we treated this fairly open-ended. So we were specifically, as I said, we connected two set of actors. So we specifically looked at what do actors perceive as dominance, with whom, in relation to whom, so who is domineering, who is dominated, and then what kind of articulations of those perceived forms of dominance are there and what they can tell us about the locations within a political system that those actors are saying this. We, of course, also linked it to the legitimization of European integration. Natasza will talk a little bit. So very briefly on empirical data, Katarzyna and Elodie, at one of the later papers in this panel, will tell you more in details when it comes to the dataset on debates on future of Europe, covering 11 national parliaments and the European Parliament, that many people in the room were for long months analyzing. So this is the one set of data, and the second set of data comes from the proposals that different types of actors in, again, multiple national arenas and on European level was delivering during the entire period of debate on future of Europe that we, for the project, used delimited between 2015 and 2022. So these two sets, and we specifically focus on the civil society organizations on two ends of a spectrum, those that are critical by default of the European integration, specifically Euro-rejects, Eurosceptic actors, but also those civil society organizations that were more pro-European, to see what do they mean if they mention explicitly or implicitly dominance. So I'll just focus to, in a previous session we discussed that as Bridget mentioned, do we focus too much on dominance? Interestingly, in the debates in 11 national parliaments, as you can see here, the dominance was detected by our researchers in almost 20% of speeches that concerned future of Europe, which is almost twice more the number of speeches that actually raised specific institutional reforms. So political actors are actually engaged in discussing this unjust relations of power within the European Union that we sort of understood as, you know, some forms of dominance. It doesn't mean how they, you know, assess it. It's just the coverage of mentioning. If you can see here, this is the percentage by specific party groups that, for comparative reasons between the national debates, we gathered. So you can see that the more to these ends of the political spectrum, the more often political actors actually mention the various forms of dominance. And of course, the report on national parliaments is going to be online in a matter of days, if not hours. So if you're interested, you can actually look into the chapters that actually in detail discuss each case in which, you know, the researchers were able to open up what it means, this dominance for particular context. For instance, just to give you a hint on this, the V4 countries, the Visegrad countries, the newer members of European Union from region we are in, were actually preoccupied with dominance despite the political and ideological sort of location, because they were sort of perceiving their peripheral location as something that can actually structurally put them in a relation of dominance. And of course, that was also specifically visible in speeches of sovereignists and Eurosceptic actors in this region, but not only. So it's not that it was specifically visible, the Swedish context and the Norway context also tells. So I'll give the voice to Natasza, who will talk more about the social actors.
impossible to do this in 4 minutes, but the report is already online, so that will help me a bit if you're interested in details. But to cut a long story short, we have looked at several different type of actors. What they have in common is that they are civil society organizations. They are more or less political, and what I mean by that is that they engage, they interact, they discuss the future of Europe, and that's why also we have gathered their proposals and analyzed them. And you can see that we grouped them along their main interests. So that will be migration, that will be gender equality. These are, of course, very broad categories, right? And faith-based organizations, for a second, I will just pass here. So then we have an anti-abortion and anti-gender ones. Then we do have Eurosceptic movements, that also, again, quite a broad category, including both Euro rejects, so those completely rejecting the very idea of EU, and also the ones that are just only criticizing it, and the movements that we called denialists, the ones that are, I would say, the most fringe, located on the fringe of the political system. But just a second to show you how we also analyzed all of these proposals. So we looked at who is dominating and who is perceived as being dominated, right? So this is in respect to the arguments we have found, and of course the articulations of this dominance. And if I would like to make it very short, interestingly, of course, if you think about dominance, and if you think about the actors who are mentioning this type of a power structure exercise, then you would think automatically about Eurosceptics, about Euro rejects, about the actors that are, let's say, somewhere on the political spectrum closer to the sovereignists. But we have also noticed that actually the pro-European actors are using this concept of dominance, but of course in a different way. So this is very interesting, at least in my opinion, that we have this usage of a concept of dominance in these two contexts. So of course for the European, for the Eurosceptic actors, we have dominance used as a rhetoric that explains, let's say, over-controlling powers of the European Union. So the stress is on unelected institutions that are dominating the national actors that are not also listening to the voice of the people. And here this populist worldview also plays a role. So the Eurosceptic, Euro-reject, EU contesting actors would very often use the populist rhetoric, outsourcing the corrupted elite from the national level to the European level, and speak about the pure people in the context of European people or purely ethnic-based in context of Eastern Europe, that would be just Poles, Slovaks, Czechs, Hungarians, yeah? And yeah, you can, thank you. And for the pro-European actors, this is also quite interesting that domination is used as a strategy, but to achieve something exactly opposite. So to claim that European Union should be more proactive. So this dominance is used as a legitimizing tool to voice more integration, more activity, more involvement of the European institutions into the national contexts. And you can, of course, see it especially when we look at the gender issues, when we look at the context of the values, and when we discuss the future of Europe in the context of the institutions and the reform. So yeah, I'm done. Yeah, sorry about that, but we're happy to answer more questions later on. Now we have Martin.
Thanks, Sergio, for that introduction. As you correctly pointed out, I'm not Asimina Michailidou. My name is Martin Mulan. I'm a doctoral fellow at ARENA, and I will be presenting 2 papers that were part of this, broader work package on public opinion and differentiated integration. And as for this part of the VP, we had sort of 3 goals. The first was to identify 3 sort of scenarios for how EU correspondents should exercise their control, could exercise their control functions and should exercise their control functions when it comes to differentiated integration. And this is something that Asimina and Hans-Jörg Trenz have written on in the International Journal of Press and Politics. And the second goal was to find some way of operationalizing differentiated integration with a view to understanding how it is debated in mass media, in social media, so at in a broader non-elite public, if you will. And we've done that using, first of all, qualitative comparative text analysis and topic models of social media discourses. And these methods were applied, first of all, to an analysis of 6 events and how they were covered between 2015 and 2020 in Germany, Denmark, and the UK. And we've also looked at Twitter debates about the refugee crisis in 2015 and COVID-19 in Greece and Germany, and looking at both how they were debated by English speakers who obviously had an interest in reaching across borders and communicating outside of their own countries, but also how that maps on to the topics that were prevalent in the native language discourses. So for this first paper that was written by Resul, Hans-Jörg, and Asimina, sort of the starting point here was to figure out, is there actually a debate about differentiated integration in the mass media? This is a niche topic, and it's something that, depending on how it is framed, is going to be more or less difficult for the general public to actually have an informed opinion about the democratic and the dominating aspects potentially of this practice. What we found when we looked at these looked at these 6 events in Germany, Denmark, and the United Kingdom was that, first of all, there's no systematic coverage of EU differentiated integration. That's not completely surprising. You're not going to have a correspondent covering EU differentiated integration. But what is maybe more, what I think is very illuminating here is that whenever there was a debate about differentiated integration, it took a very national perspective. It wasn't really focused on debates, on these debates as European debates or these crises as European crises, but they mainly focused on national actors, the impact for national politicians, for national citizens, and this is something that really is potentially a hindrance to this emergence of a European public sphere to the extent that that is a desirable thing. And in terms of the policy contributions here, we would argue that we need sort of, in order to have more focus on these potential dominating effects of a lot of these practices. For instance, the refugee crisis. For instance, the sovereign debt crisis. You need a strengthening of investigative independent journalism directed at the EU, for instance, by opening up the institutions more also to journalists not based in Brussels. This is a large debate. And that is something that could potentially make it easier for people, for regular citizens, essentially, to have informed opinions about these issues. On the Twitter paper that me and Asimina wrote together, we looked at, as I said, the refugee crisis and COVID-19. And what we find, I think, actually overlaps perfectly with what's found, you know, in these traditional media debates, because we find a lot of the same discourses in the German and Greek Twitter discourses, but they still have this very national character. So even if the topics converge in a way, they discuss a lot of the same things. It's discussed with this very particular national lens. It's discussed in terms of how has this impacted us, and you know, for something like the conditions for refugees, you know, in the Greek discourses, we find, of course, a lot of references to the refugee camps, which were right outside the doors of these users. Whereas in Germany, we find, you know, these discussions about housing of refugees, which was a very large discussion in that media sphere. For COVID-19, it might be, you know, a function of us having, you know, a period in which it was maybe less politicized. It was more about the health response, but there was little overt discussion of policy that moved beyond sort of, you know, discussing how far you should go in terms of lockdowns, essentially. And there was also especially a very small degree of debate about EU policies. So what we take from that is that social media can facilitate some sort of European discourse, but it can't really unmoor people from national vantage points. They're still going to be sort of situated in their own, you know, perspectives. They're still going to have a national lens on how they view a lot of these issues. But at the same time, you know, we see that social media is being used organically when people feel the need to communicate across borders. Otherwise, why would you, as a Greek, write in English to a large audience? It is obviously because you have a desire to reach across borders. And that points to the sort of very key democratic importance of this social media infrastructure, and that is an importance that, of course, needs to be reflected in how it is regulated by European political actors. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
You need to go there.
Thank you, and my presentation is also somehow complementary to what we just heard from Martin, because we've been also looking into media narratives and how this relates to different sets of things which are linked to our bigger project, but especially looking into European public sphere and what this could tell us about the dynamic between the integration, the differentiated integration, democracy, and dominance. So what we tried to do in particular is to have an empirical contribution. We focused on the discourse about reforms, EU reforms, in selected leading national business newspapers. I'll come to the methodology and why we chose business newspapers in which countries and so on in a second. And really the goal was to disentangle the discursive patterns between these different concepts of differentiation between the national and the European level. So you will hear again quite a lot, and it's interesting to see that our results are kind of consistent with the results that we just heard from Martin. What we took into consideration is 20 years, so since 2001 to 2021, 20/beginning of 22, and it's important to qualify a bit which were the main moments. I mean, we all know in this room which were the main moments that were advancing the debate, the public and the political debate around a reform of the institution. Definitely the big chunk, the first big chunk is the European Constitution process between 2001 and 2005. Then there is, within this section, there is also the part on enlargement, which played a bigger role within that segment of time frame. Then there was the treaty revision, which was a little bit like the fallback after the constitution process failed, but kind of at the same time and influencing the public debate was the global financial crisis and the euro crisis subsequently, and we'll see exactly what it meant in the pattern of media reporting over there. And then, similar to what we just heard, we also looked at the health crisis and the energy crisis and the war in Ukraine, even though the data that we were analyzing was only up to the beginning of 2021, by the end of 2021. So we have a little bit less evidence on what happened this year on that matter. But first of all, as I say, like why we were looking at European debates in media, in the absence of the European media, we were looking at how Europe is reported in national newspapers. This was building up on a research that we made a few years before starting that process. So it's important to give you this slide of background where we analyzed actually a corpus from 1945 to 2020 in order to check the frequency purely at the quantitative level of articles which were speaking about Europe. And clearly this pattern, this was on different newspapers than the ones that we were analyzing on the more recent research for EU3D. This was considering La Stampa for Italy, Le Monde for France, and the Spiegel for Germany. You can clearly see the pattern that from the late 90s on, there's been an increase of the frequency of speaking about Europe. And we zoomed in exactly on these 20 years, these last 20 years after the introduction of the euro, to zoom in and qualify a little bit. And we chose these research questions, to what extent the needs of reforms were addressed over time. Also, we chose reforms as a proxy for the wider debate about the future of Europe and about how the debate, I mean, how there is a frame about the polity, EU as a polity is seen not only in the present but also in an evolutionary pattern. And so we've seen to what extent these needs for reforms were addressed, which are the patterns, which were the patterns of media coverage in these three newspapers, we looked at this national European level, so we tried to quantify this actually, and then we've been looking at if there were shared narratives. The methodology that we used was indeed, as I said before, we chose these 3 business newspapers because we thought that they were comparable. They are rather technical newspapers, but at the same time, in those technical newspapers, because the economic policies are part of the core of the competencies at the EU level, we thought that we could have found a more European level kind of debate over there. We took Handelsblatt from Germany, Les Echos in France, and the Sole 24 Ore from Italy. And we focused on articles that contained patterns that were matching Europe. You will see that words are truncated on purpose because of the way it has been used for analyzing this 78,985 between January 2000 and March 2022 with a topic modeling analysis and natural language processing. So we did all these, and I will just show you quite quickly some of the results for each of the questions that we were asking ourselves. So first of all, the extent to which the needs for the reforms were addressed over time, we found out that these were cyclical and they were mainly linked to specific events which were newsworthy and bringing to the attention of the general public the debate over the European reforms. So I mentioned before some of the main historical events in these 20 years. And what is interesting, I would say, is that you will see that the attention span is very short, in the sense that you have peaks where you have more coverage of this kind of issues related to a debate over European reforms, but then this fades afterwards until there is the next crisis. So that's one of the first, let's say, overall image that our analysis gave it to us. The second thing is about the patterns. So what are the patterns of coverage? And broadly speaking, we've been finding a certain synchronization. So this synchronization, to a certain extent, is supportive of the idea that not only we've been speaking more about Europe, but we also been speaking more about Europe at the same time about the same issues. So to a certain extent, supports a bit the theory that there is at least an embryonic formation of a common debate, right? But then the next question that we were trying to ask was about the national and European level. And that's where the thing starts to get a little bit blurred and more complicated. So all in all, I will just show you quickly because the details, but basically you can see the blue is Europe and the gray is domestic. But this is not within the corpus of the overall reporting, it's within the corpus of the articles that are speaking about European reforms. So clearly, I mean, this is for Il Sole 24 Ore, clearly you see that pattern that the European level, it's subordinated to the national one. You see also here a clear more the European level within the Euro crisis year, so between 2012 and 2015 is clearly there, it clearly shows, but there is also an overall peak of speaking about Europe kind of things. And what is interesting, and we're not expecting that so much, but even your Twitter analysis about the COVID years is the fact that even though COVID was perceived as a common issue, in the end the debate was not so much about Europe, but was about issue itself. So you can see that it's quite down, you know, even in terms of overall frequency. You will see a similar pattern as well for Les Echos with a different kind of overall thing, but basically also there you see down from 2019 on. Yeah, you have a question? The time. No, but it's almost finished. It's almost finished. And then the same for Andersblatt as well. So this to say, to conclude, basically, that European aspect, once again, play more and more important role, but the national narratives are still predominant. How to interpret this? I think it's ambivalent. So on one hand, we can say this is the symptom of the fact that we have still a problem about the national versus the European. But also, if we look at the way the theory of differentiation is being put into this room, there is also a more complex explanation or thing that we might want to explore and dig deeper, because the fact that European issues are considered domestic issues means also that the European polity is becoming more and more part of the normal cycles of reporting. So there is a little bit of both into this, and I think this is worth to further explore in the future. Voilà, that's all I wanted to say for the moment, but I'm sure that we can have more questions afterwards. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. And Magda already mentioned some things about our work, which was focused on the national parliaments. We also included the European Parliament, but for this, for the sake of this presentation, we focus only on the national, on the political actors in the national parliaments. And as you can see, we are just the presenters, but of course behind that work, there are lots of people who contributed to the report, which is already online. We'll say about this in a minute. Yeah, exactly. So for our research, we're focusing on national parliaments and treating why national parliaments? Basically, because we treated parliaments as a specific space of the public sphere, which both in a way reflects what's going on in national context, but also impacts the debate on national context. Obviously, for the sake of the report, we are focusing on all 3 Ds, but speaking in the presentation, we'll be just talking about the democracy. So basically, the main research was, our research for the sake of this presentation was how do the political actors in the national parliaments envision the constitutional democratic outline of the EU in the future. And to show you how much work we did, we were analyzing, we selected first 196 plenary debates. So there were altogether 666 speeches. And then out of these, about 58% of these speeches were basically relating somehow to the future of Europe debate. And these were the base for our qualitative analysis. So as you can see, there was lots of work done. And the time frame, we were focusing on the debates which were covering time from 2015 up to 2021. And the selection covered the parliaments from different European countries. We wanted to have the representation of countries from different, situated differently geographically speaking, but also in terms of kind of the history of the relation with the EU, so old member states and the new member states, or newer member states, and also in the analysis we also included Norway, which is a cooperating associated country. So the main findings. So it very much actually corresponds with what was said already. What we found in our analysis, it was that basically the debate on the future of Europe is very much triggered or related to the national debates, to the issues which are important for the local constituencies, for the member country in question. So even if these debates were more or less similarly intensive, I would say, with the exception of Denmark, but this is also related to the way the Danish parliament works. There is a lot of interactions taking over the speeches, so this is why the number is so much higher in terms in context in the case of Danish parliament. In other countries, the intensity or the kind of the percentage of speeches which related to the future of Europe debate was more or less the same. But what was differentiating the countries, it was what triggered these debates. So in case of for example, just to give you some examples, in case of Italy or Greece, it was the economic crisis which played an important role, or was kind of initiating the debate on the future of Europe. In Hungary, this was migration. And for example, Brexit also triggered the discussion, or was particularly important for triggering discussion in Greece, Denmark, or in Norway.
Yeah. So when looking at who actually speaks on the future of Europe in national parliaments, so the main actors, we grouped, as Magda said previously, the political parties in party families, and we so that the debate was in many parliaments really polarized, with notably Eurosceptic actors, even when there were minor political parties in parliaments that were very active on the topic of the future of Europe, but also sort of strong proponents of European integration that were also very active on it. So you have a very conflicting debate on the future of Europe in parliaments. One of the dimensions that we looked at was about EU institutional reforms, and who actually request reforms of the EU in national parliaments. And the first finding was that it actually remained on the background of the discussion on the future of Europe, amounting for approximately 11% of the future of Europe speeches. It was mostly present in France, Norway, and Slovakia, and also debated more from liberal parties or conservative parties that were from the majority. So for instance, in France would be liberals after 2017, but in Hungary would be rather the conservative parties that would discuss institutional reforms. The most frequent institutional reform mentioned was actually a sort of no reform, because it was to maintain the status quo, so not having any treaty changes, and that was particularly referred to in Italy, in Norway, and Slovakia. And it means that the political actors were either not willing to further expand EU integration, or actually not willing or not able to diminish it neither, so they would stay in a sort of status quo when it comes to how the EU institutional setting operates. The second most frequently addressed reform was about the role of national parliaments and sort of strengthening their oversight on EU affairs. So as we analyze national parliaments, seems quite logical. The third one was about direct democracy instrument, and that was especially mentioned in France and Denmark. In France, it was in sort of relation to the President Macron request for having EU-wide public consultation, that a similar format that was done on the national level, and that somehow resulted also in the conference on the future of Europe. As for Denmark, it was more about having referendum as the way it would function on the national level, and notably on Danish opt-outs of certain policies. Overall, strengthening and weakening EU institution followed a sort of pro and anti-EU divide in national parliaments. We also analyzed sort of three key narratives on the future of EU democracy. Federal union, intergovernmentalism, or a sort of cosmopolitan regional model. And what we witnessed in national parliament was that it was either discussed in intergovernmental terms or federal terms, but the cosmopolitan regional appeal of the EU was not brought up almost at all in analyzed national parliaments. The result also shows that there is inconsistencies in narratives depending on specific policies or policy instrument, or also on crisis response. So for instance, in Germany, the CDU-CSU governing coalition and party in parliament would usually push forward a much more intergovernmental model of European integration. But when it comes, for instance, to the response of the migration crisis, then they would push for more federal policy instruments. And also the last results on the sort of narratives on the future of Europe was this sovereignist narratives that emerge or re-emerge from national parliaments, and that was detected in many of the parliaments that we analyzed. It was about stressing national sovereignty and asking for cooperation of sovereign nation states. But it was actually quite contradictory in its nature, because members of parliament were asking for competencies that are on the supranational level to be repatriated to the national level, with still keeping the benefit of integration. And that was, for instance, very present in Poland with the ruling party.
Yes, so to conclude, as I mentioned earlier, the national debates are very much related to the national issues, which is in line with the findings which were already reported. What was also very interesting, and we were actually surprised by this finding, is that in the national parliaments which we studied, there was no really much discussion on the actually institutional setup. I mean, this topic, yeah, we were surprised because we expected, starting this project, this research, we expected there would be more on that. So, but as you heard, you know, most of the actors would be actually for no change or without any specific proposals. And so actors were mostly focused on the policies requiring immediate actions, which refers, I guess, somehow in line with what was earlier said, that policies may be important issues triggering the debate rather than the debate about the polity itself. And there wasn't really coherent and detailed visions of integration presented in the national parliaments. And as Elodie already mentioned, what we noticed also, there is this new narrative which gains the importance and weight in the national parliaments. What I also would like to boast off with, so the project, the report is online as of today, so whoever would like to learn more about our research and also about our other Ds, please do refer to the website and enjoy reading. Thank you.
Magda, how many minutes we have for?
I think something like 20 plus minutes for this
Okay,
session.
good. Please, go ahead. Yeah, you can get this one.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. I really enjoyed that set of papers. And Magdalena and Natasza, you've almost convinced me about the importance of dominance and dominating. I found that something we really have to take into account, and I was a little bit skeptical before. So thank you very much. I've got one question concerning the issues which were taken for measuring public opinion, to Giuseppe and others, really. Obviously focusing on what happened during crises, and interestingly enough, the decline in coverage in more recent times during COVID and so on. But two kind of counterexamples would be very interesting. It's perhaps too recent to see how much coverage of European issues. One is of the scandal, the overblown but still very prominent Qatar-gate thing in the European Parliament, to what extent there's been coverage of that. But much more importantly, the 2019 European Parliament elections, when according to what you had, it was relatively, it was on the downward scale, and yet to me, the striking thing about 2019 was that turnout, after going down in every election, went up 8% for Europe as a whole. Why was that? There must have been some European debate. It can't have been just 27 national debates all coinciding and raising turnout. So I'd love to know a little bit about that. And really, especially to Dirk and Max, I think I would love to know more about national differentiation in your findings. To what extent it varied from country to country. And to some extent that's true also of the national parliament research. You obviously selected a lot of countries, but you didn't select all of them, and it would be really interesting to know about that. And similarly for Giuseppe, which is obviously a few media in a few big countries. It would be nice to know about the smaller countries. And final comment, I think it would be really interesting to do a study of the views of people working in the EU institutions. Obviously, I'm biased because I worked almost 40 years in the European Parliament. But I was struck by how views on the future of Europe changed over time. When I started in 1979, when in Max's and Dirk's thing, it was only the EEC concept rather than the present, much more powerful EU, there were far more people who believed in a federal direction for Europe. By the time I retired in 2016, people, maybe they wanted greater European integration, but there wasn't the same idealism or the same sense of inevitability. So it's not just the free models you describe, it's also perceptions of where the EU is going, and I'd like to have your comment on that. Sorry, I've been a bit long, but there were so many stimulating points in those papers.
We can join another question, if there is. Okay, if somebody is thinking, we can. Okay, we start to answer.
Shall we go? I can show some findings. But I can show some of these findings relating to Francis, your first question. So thanks very much. We have data in our slides that differentiate across the 8 countries on 4 of the items, which scored high on the dimensions of. That's at the very end. So let me walk you through. Here we go. Here we go. So it's a little small, so don't mind that. So this is Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, Poland, Greece, France, and Italy. And this is the core Europe question. This is the consent for opt-out. So recall that the others should be consenting whenever a country does not want to join a EU policy. This is the a la carte, and this is the no exclusion of norm-breaching member states. And so this scored high on the federalist factor, if you want to, so or thinking of the supranational or the central or the European level, and these scored lower, so more on the national, protecting national autonomy. And clearly we do find some noteworthy variation as expected by your question, so that's absolutely correct. I think the more interesting patterns clearly, and that will be visually very easily to see on the right-hand side of this graph. So we do find some noteworthy findings to a la carte. So this is something, I'm a German, and Germans apparently are very much scared of any form of moral hazard. Brian Redman and others have showed that nicely. All those from Southern Europe know that very well in the Eurozone crisis. So this sort of corresponds that. This is interesting because this is Ireland here, and we were wondering why this may be the case. That we have somebody here, maybe because of Brexit also. So yes, that was in 2021, I think. So I would also think it's cherry picking. In German we say it's Rosinen picking, and we have one article on is there a fair type of raisin picking, and we believe yes, but our fellow Germans don't acknowledge this. So this right-hand graph is also quite interesting, or we find it interesting, and this is whether norm-breaching member states should be excluded. And why do I find this finding interesting? We had, as I said earlier, really states that violate core fundamental norms of the EU in mind, but apparently the respondents in our survey were also thinking of the Stability and Growth Pact, because we here do find a little coalition of states such as Poland that may have been concerned about the fundamental rights issue. I don't know whether at least a simple majority of Poles says, no, this is not at all a good idea. We find the same in Italy. So that's obviously maybe related to the Stability and Growth Pact, or Greece also, and Ireland. And here we have the classic states where you would expect that, kick out those or throw out those from certain policies. So the Nordics, so Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. So this is a pattern that corresponds nicely. One last sentence, I don't want to monopolize that here, but you were asking also about the development over times, and I would share with you, obviously the survey data that we've been presenting here was from a later point in time, so I can't trace that over time, but we do find rather little support of really strong federalists. So apart from the young European federalists, we do find very little. So our take on it is that citizens have increasingly become, even the pro-European citizens have become aware of the fact that many of their fellow citizens value the nation state very strongly. And Europe always needs supermajorities, and you can't just push a federal Europe through, because that would have very strong repercussions. So I would agree with your assessment. Max, do you want to add, or?
Maybe. So it's. I've also been involved with coding for these national parliamentary debates, and I think for this federalist question, I think it's interesting when you did this policy. I think Elodie said, yeah, CDU maybe not so much a federalist, more an intergovernmentalist narrative, except for sort of distribution of refugees across member states, and similarly could find on sort of the Free Democrats, so the economically liberal party in Germany, presents in its institutional terms very much sort of a federalist narrative, to strengthen the European Union, but then when it comes to fiscal integration, it's also a very, core issue of federation or federal union. They are very much against it. So there we have these internal contradictions between what institutions parties like, but what consequences for the policies they want. And so I think this is sort of an illustration why this federal narrative is sort of not working out.
I thought the coalition agreement in Germany explicitly say we are engaged in setting up a federal state in Europe. So that is the ambiguity is really in the word as well as in the deeds. Okay, Magda, you want to answer?
I think we got a question on the selection of data when it comes to parliaments. Of course, we were trying to do as much as possible using our consortium capabilities, particularly in terms of language, to do as much as possible north, south, east, west, as Katarzyna was saying, older members, younger members. But this is what we came out with. And of course, I think one of the beauty of this research is that there is so much nuance in the national. So one of our conclusions that is not on the slide is that it is not really segmented debates, if you wish, but it's not also kind of debate that is already Europeanized, if you wish. So you have this national nuances, national topics that raise the discussion. Also this incoherency that Katarzyna, Elodie, and Max a minute ago raised. It's also located in different places, in different countries. And one thing that I think is overarching theme here is that a lot of this discussion is really policy driven. So, political actors are, and I think this goes back to your comment on what we should do in the future, which means to research also the people inside the EU institutions, is that, this also shows in many instances that a lot of people are specializing in a certain areas that are policy driven, and their views on what's supposed to be done is driven by the context of that policy, and the polity is so, you know, overarching and massive that sometimes this is lost in a process. And I think this is also very interesting in our research on parliaments, that you actually go into the national stories and you have a, you know, very interesting dynamics of external and internal factors, but also these themes that are common in a way everywhere, right? In all of this context that we research, and if we would go beyond that, I think that would be still interesting. We have Norway, which sort of fits brilliantly to the debate, right? And keeps debating all of those aspects on the way. Yeah, yes, I'll...
No, Martin, you want to finish my right hand and then we go to the
yeah. Sure. Thank you very much for interesting questions. On this point about crises and public opinion, and how that fits into a broader pattern of all of these times where there aren't, crises galvanizing Euroscepticism. I think you're right that there's, at least for the 2019 EP elections, there was probably European issues involved that sort of went beyond just antagonism towards national governments. We know from earlier research that even if to a large extent EP elections still mirror what's happening at national level, they are increasingly Europeanized. So I think that is something to look into, especially because crises tend to galvanize Eurosceptic sentiment. That's an important point. And on this point about the views of the future of Europe inside the EU institutions, I find that especially interesting, coming from a country that has very vocally said exactly what it thought about joining the EU a couple of times. I think this is something that would be interesting to do, not only for the EU institutions, but also for those at the national level who engage the most with the EU, with EU policies, to sort of see if, okay, is there, what's driving what here? Like, to what extent is there a convergence? Where are these impulses coming from? I think that's a very interesting question for future research.
Thanks, Martin. Giuseppe.
Yes, so some stuff have been said already. It will be very interesting to have a separate debate about the ever closer union versus, I mean, this is like huge and philosophical. Maybe we can discuss about it afterwards in a coffee or a drink later. But about the frequency of reporting during the European Parliament elections in 2014, when we zoom in the dates of the elections in 14 and the date of elections in 19, we find peaks there in both sides. What is the macro data showing is that the overall debate about European reforms was much higher during the period of the 2010s, especially during the Euro crisis, than in that side of the, and this especially after 2019, what we were looking into was 2020 and COVID, and remarking that there was a little peak about the discussion on next generation EU, but that peak was not as big as we would have expected. Like we thought that this would have been really like a momentum kind of in the public debate. And that was not. So that was more what we wanted to show over there, rather than I don't have the full answer to the why we got the increase in turnout, which is something that we need to of course welcome and be happy about.
I think Magda already covered the issues. She explained how we did the research on the parliaments, national parliaments, but maybe just to add and elaborate on your suggestion that future, maybe we should look into, talk to people who actually work at the EU. And then Martin suggested that we maybe should talk to the actually people at the national level. It's very interesting because in a way we did it, we didn't talk, but we looked what they are saying, yes, in the parliaments about the future of the EU. And I guess we didn't add to our presentation that also what was interesting, and I can speak from the Polish case, yeah, that the speaking about the future of the EU was very much following the logic of the kind of party competition. So because in case of Poland, the EU became very much politicized. So of course, just speaking, I guess, in private and anonymously could maybe allow for elaborating and showing, revealing what they really think about the future of the EU and the prospects.
Okay, I think we have still time for another question. If you
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on parliaments, and I don't know if you have data on this, and I actually also don't know how much it matters, but earlier, at least in some countries, there was a strong tradition of amateur politicians. And do you have any sense of the development now at the national parliamentary level in terms of the distinction between amateur and professional politicians? And do you think it makes any difference? I'm also asking now because the changes in the party system, the fact that parties themselves are socially dislocated, I think maybe that distinction between amateur and professional might be more important, because now talking about professional could mean that you have been inside the party system, the political socialization process. And that also has to do with the role conceptions of politicians, to what extent they are being socialized into a conduct of politics. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it would also be interesting to see, to juxtapose the debate in parliaments with the debates in public, to what extent there is a debate. Because in Norway, the political system has a lid on debating EU membership issues. There is a set of gag rules against this. So they are now actually having a bit of a debate as to whether they should have a debate on the EU issue. So it's very pathological, the whole system in that sense. And that is a democratic problem in itself, that you don't have a proper debate on these types of issues. So I think what happens in member states, this cannot happen, because you have parliamentary elections and so on. You are forced to take a stance. But when you are in a close affiliation without actually membership, you don't have any compunction. You don't need to follow anything. You could just float around and think that you are not affiliated and so on. And the world is just suddenly falling into your head with some kind of directives and so on you don't like, that have been passed 10 years ago. I mean, this is also what the actors are telling us. Oh, by the way, the EU passed the directive 5 years ago. Now it's hitting us. Now we don't like this. What are we going to do?
Should also mention that the debate on whether to have a debate was inconclusive.
Yeah, so for the professionalization, I think for the as the German example of the Bundestag, there are two ways to sort of respond to John Eric's question. First, about of professionalization, I think what is interesting for this time period that we covered is that there's one legislative period where the alternative for Germany was not yet in, and then the first one where they joined. Or where they sort of got over the electoral threshold. And there you have mostly new people speaking, and that now looking forward for following more legislative periods in the future, I think for these new parties, these challenger parties, which of course start out with very radical positions maybe, how they evolve over time. And once they are socialized and re-elected and working in these committees, how does it change their language? Could be some sort of learning or socialization process, even for sort of the more radical parties. And then I would say that at least for Germany, I cannot speak for the other national parliaments, the debates that we here covered also have, of course, a sort of a selection bias, because a lot of these Future of Europe debates are associated with European Council summits where the Chancellor first speaks and then the other parties respond and ask questions and criticize. And these are often, of course, leading figures in the parties who speak in these debates. And the second type of debate that we have are more related sort of to economic governance and also the refugee question, is that those are then about European laws and how to make them and how to implement them and so on, where people are very specialized in their committees in the Bundestag, which has very strong committee system, and then they report on what they decided in a committee in the plenary, which we analyze. So there you might have less leading figures in the parties, but policy experts, again, something that speaks more to professional politics than rather sort of amateur debate and opinion taking.
I would like to add something that I think speaks to your question, and is maybe a little bit broader. I think what we saw in many national contexts is that parliaments are really weakened on the way, and that you can see first the growing role of the executive, but also the crisis of parliamentarism. It's not even, right? I mean, it depends on the case, but in some cases that we studied, parliaments really are becoming a voting machines for the majority, and that really limits the actual public debate on relevant issues. But this process is not only visible, I think, only in the countries that you would say, it's visible on, but it's a trend. And I think, one of the findings is that there is no much of the coherent debate. And one of the aspects why there is no is that they don't do it because they are actually engaged in something else, and they are very much controlled by the executives, particularly when it comes to the European affairs. And I think this, to some extent, shows some broader process when it comes to the parliaments in our research, which of course is uneven, as I said, and not concerning all of the cases full-fledged, but something that we definitely reflect on in the report and possibly in the future research.
Okay, I think we have, do we have the human right to drink a coffee or the?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so we have a coffee break.
Okay, so we have a coffee break, and we convene here at 4:30. Is fine? Or is okay? Sorry. Sorry.
Stephen.
No, it's okay. Stephen. I'll ask after. You are in favor of coffee, right? Okay, good. So 4:30 here. Thanks. Thank you.